Hey everybody, my name is Parks. I am joined here today at a Starbucks by Weldon Green. Thank you so much for coming out. I have a couple questions for you about your job, about why you're here in LA in the summer. The weather, of course. It's actually, really nice today. So my first question is, you are often called down to LA, oftentimes by TSM and some other teams as well. So you have before worked with teams full time, and you've also worked in kind of these last minute crunch situations. So how much easier is it for you to actually do your job when it's just a full-time thing ongoing, you have a lot of time, and that the time isn't really a factor, versus now when it's, playoffs are in a couple weeks and you've really got to kind of get them back into gear very quickly?
I think that depends on what job I've been hired to do. So, for example, I've been hired as a coach, and I've also been hired as a sports psychology, you would say therapist, except I don't want to use that term. So like consultant, or somebody who just meets one-on-one with players to deal with their mindset issues. And then, so obviously when I'm dealing with a single player's long-term development, then it kind of doesn't matter as much that it's like an instantaneous, like 1 week thing. Like that only progresses over the course of years, months and years of work. So if I'm doing one-on-one work with a player, there's no expectation of immediate performance increase. It's more of a thing that we plan on him becoming a better performer over time. If I'm working as a coach, where I'm coming in and trying to coach a team, for example, 2016 TSM or 2017 G2, then that's a different thing. And obviously just being there full time and permanently and being able to watch training is really, really important. And if it's more like coming in for a boot camp to try to reset mentality and get a boost in performance, I mean, it's kind of like a placebo effect anyway. But obviously any time that you'd have a team and you boot camp them and take them to a new location or have new faces or have new ideas, you can shake things up. That's why there's roster changes, to try to improve teams even when it might not even be a problem. With the specific roster, they just need a shake up to get a boost in performance. So there's all of these different jobs and positions and factors that go into answering that question, but I hope that was useful.
Yeah, that's definitely useful. And we have seen a lot of shakeups in the North American LCS. We can talk about that in a little bit. First, I got to talk to Sven last week about the team and kind of what they feel like some of their struggles are. And he mentioned that they didn't really feel like they had any sort of identity and not really even knowing where to start with that. So I imagine that's a large part of what you're to do with them this week. How much of your kind of job and ability is focused on actually finding the identity and helping them out? Is that kind of the main thing, or is it you just kind of unlock their ability to do that for themselves?
I mean, one of the activities that I do in kind of my initial boot camps with teams is, in fact, role identification. So looking, first of all, at group dynamics. So like, what roles do you have as a member of a sports team, as a competitive group of guys, right? And these are the same roles from traditional sport, whether it's traditional or esport. I think it's pretty much the same. And then as far as functional strategy, I've worked a lot, specifically in League of Legends over the years, of understanding, what dynamics you need to be successful in the Rift. And so working with the communication and making sure that is squared away, and that we have the roles that we need for the different strategic things that should happen in League. Like, I would say that most of the performance benefit or the performance boost that I have in teams is because of that work, actually.
Well, it's definitely good to have you then this week. With all the craziness going on in the North American LCS, there have been other teams that don't seem to have an identity. There are players that seem to kind of be struggling with some of the pressure. We have Academy coming up, and long-time LCS starters going down to Academy. We've got big coaching changes. With all of this added pressure, what changes for these players and their mentality, and what are things that they need to be aware of, to stay on top performance-wise, to not burn out, things like that?
I think it forces maturity on them. I think that it's been, esports started with very centralized player power, and so they could create the situations that were best for them, which is that they wouldn't be challenged and they would have a secure job, more or less. And now it's more hinged on performance, which means it's more stressful, which means you have to deal with consequences for and regrets based on like your training habits and your intentions and how disciplined you are. So I think that it creates a lot more pressure on the individual to be a more mature person, and that can that's a good thing and a bad thing. I think that it's a bad thing because we don't have a ramp up to this professional life. Like we don't have an NCAA, and a high school ball and a kind of a thing like that allow people to make silly mistakes, get benched a few times, recover from them, learn and grow. It's just like, here, go into the entertainment pro league and figure it out there. So I think that is a bad thing there. But on the other hand, it is what it is. So if you can't handle the fire, get out of the kitchen or something like that. I think that's how it goes.
Yeah, something like that. I guess that's an interesting point that I hadn't really thought about, that we don't have the ramp up. So
yeah, I think that so for the players, like, of course it's important to be able to handle benching with a lot of hope and about their own development, and the idea of acceptance also of their own skill level now, and try harding and not burning out. And I think that there's a lot of different ways to handle that, from resting to vacation to training less to training more, depending on the player's mentality. I'm more excited to see it finally happening for coaches. I think for many years, coaches in esport, and particularly in League of Legends, has been more like just like a networking thing, where you just get hired because you worked for an esport team before. So like the fact that franchising is here, and these teams have they have locked in contracts now with players, and it's harder to make changes in the season to pacify fans. They have to make some sort of change. So obviously a coach is one of those roles that you can do that with, because it's easier to find unlocked coaches, right? Coaches that are not under contract lock, and just like swap that out and see what's happening. So I think that coaching is also a performance-based role, and you should be winning and losing, and your skill level should be determining whether you win or you lose. And so if you lose a lot, you should lose your job. And if you win a lot, you should get more jobs and more promotion, right? And I think that that's happening now with coaching. So I'm excited by that prospect, as I am also sad that there's also no development for coaches. There's not a lot of professional level coaching or opportunities for coaching below the entertainment or elite level. And so, there's not a lot of space to learn the skills that you would need in pro esport.
And you point to the fact as well that a lot of these guys may not have a long history. So how long do you think is too long for someone to not perform as a coach? And then also, do you then also work with coaches? Or is that something that's on your mind, about working with coaches for some of this performance, mental resetting and stuff like that as well?
I've done coach development, coach training. That's actually what my core mission is in esport, going all the way back to when I started in esport in 2012. But as far as how many chances should they be given, that's totally up to the organization, right? I would say that the issue that most orgs have right now is because they want to save money, and so they're hiring mid-20s professionals, because to be honest, if you're looking at head coaches in traditional sport, they're usually mid-30s to 40s before you even get to that level, and they cost a lot of money. And so esport orgs right now are kind of just hedging their bets and hoping to get somebody who's maybe good at their job, and save a ton of money by hiring somebody who's early in their career. And I think that you get what you pay for. Only sometimes you might get a really good deal. Like for example, Saint. I'm sure that he's performing far above his pay grade right now. And then I think that there are some coaches who are just probably pretty useless, and making a lot of money, which kudos to them, right? I'm not maligning them at all. That's amazing if you can land that job, and then maybe you learn stuff while you're there, and then you get better at it the next time you do it. So that's awesome, But it's not going to be that way forever. So take advantage now. Get that sweet coaching gig when it's still not as performance-based as it should be.
Well, I am interested to see how that develops then, the coaching side of things and those changes, especially since, you made a good point. They're not necessarily under the same contracts as these players are. So we may see more of those. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Reddit. Unfortunately, people oftentimes bring up the Weldon Effect, saying that you come in and you are very helpful for a team, and they do really well for 3 or 4 weeks, maybe 5 or 6, and then slowly they start to kind of go down back to old habits, and they don't have the same practices that you instilled in them. Their mental strength maybe declines a little bit. There's some atrophy there. Is this something that you personally can help them fight against, or is it really just on them kind of being mature and continuing these practices that you've given them? And how much truth is there to actually a Weldon Effect, or is it maybe just we see a big spike in improvement and then it's actually just steady, and so we feel like it's declining because they're not still spiking?
Yeah, I've seen the commentation about this, and the Weldon Effect is basically from me just kind of like doing the job of a coach, meaning that I'm like making sure that the training environment is as optimal as possible, and that we learn as much as possible in a given day. And to do that, you have to keep exciting the brain, like getting up, living in the same house with the same people, waking up every single day, doing the same thing, training the same amount of scrims, and then going to the same LCS studio and playing the same games. You get lulled. Because that's what it is. What it is, So when I'm coaching a team full time, one of the things that I do as a coach, what every traditional sports coach does, and what every professional coach does, is they try to find ways of making the same thing new again, trying to make it exciting for the brain, because the brain is not fooled by the fact that something's important. If you've done it 6 times leading up to it, and you're about to do it 6 more times, it's like, aha, you tell me that's important, but I don't believe you because we're about to do it 12 more times and we just did it 12 times. So I just think it's just like a normal everyday thing, and I don't have to pay attention. So I'm just really good at doing that, and then teams only want to hire me for a few days, and then I leave, and then the training effect reduces and the learning effect reduces, and that's the end of it.
So it's not at all that it's just a not helpful thing long term. It's just actually different.
There is no way to do it long term. So what you're discussing is trait-based for state-based changes in the brain. So there are state-based changes, which are like permanent neurological changes, and there are trait-based changes, which are like temporary changes that as soon as you stop doing something, then the effect has a cooldown period till it disappears. So state-based changes are stuff like you get molested when you're a child, or like you get abused, or these things that have permanent damage to your psyche that you can see at the neurological level, and that we deal with at the psychological level in terms of treatment, right? And then of course everybody's looking for state-based changes on the positive side, like how much mindfulness or meditation or monk kind of living do you need to improve the brain permanently? But in reality, I mean, our brains are pretty much all the same and pretty normal. And by normal, I mean, fitting in the middle of the bell curve, right? The exceptional people on the end of the bell curve are like usually on the aneurotypical side, so like really serious changes like autism and Down syndrome, which are not, they're just different ways of experiencing reality, or on the other end, the same thing. So I think that like most average performers are kind of like average people in terms of how the brain looks. That's just like a pet. This is a comment, right? It's not a research finding, so careful there. But then, these trait-based changes, the things that we want out of athletes, they're just things like, being motivated and focusing harder and learning as much as we can every day, which are things that, you just gotta keep working on all the time, because those aren't things that we turn on in our human brains and then just leave on. And it's the same as living a normal life, working a normal job. You have periods of high motivation, low motivation. So, they're trait-based effects. They're not make permanent changes in the brain. It's just like good habits, and then your habits decay. And you got to make better habits.
And so I guess one of the ways to keep the habits from decaying is for you to be with someone for a full season, or with them to really, really be serious after your time is over with them.
That can happen on the individual level. Mm-hmm. It's never going to happen on the team level. There's a big difference, right? So like, of course, I can work with a player and they can improve themselves and develop over a long period of time in one-on-ones, and then they're a different person, and they can maintain their own habits and maintain their own like very focused, intensity toward the game. I would say, for example, Mithy is like that already. He trained himself to be always turned on towards the game, and I think Doublelift is a good example of that too, where he's like, he takes it very seriously and he's able to sustain that kind of effort. But that is irrelevant to how a team functions. A team is always going to be a non-sustainable thing unless there's effort put in from everybody, and there's always going to be a weak link, and that's just accepted. I mean, it's how it is. You can't have a team of all perfect people. You have to make compromises.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for kind of clarifying that a little. So then, I feel like a lot of people then also will experience burnout. And I know when you were with TSM in 2016, you guys had a very rigorous schedule, and you talked about how it wasn't something that even that would be unsustainable very long term because of how much you guys actually were working. So I'm curious, with burnout, like, where is there, like what are the payoffs with working harder and having fun with what you're doing, having free time to reset, or spending more time to continue practicing, and how do you kind of know when is a good time to turn off for a little bit?
So training load is what that's called in traditional sport. What is my training load, and then at what point does it become, how do I modify it to make sure I can recover? And it's pretty straightforward. You can measure burnout both biometrically and psychometrically. So when I was training with TSM, we just straight up measured it, and when I saw that people were approaching burnout, we toned it down. And then once the weakest link, was recovered, we would turn it back up again. I think that the traditional thing in esport is that you don't have a coach, a sports scientist on staff, like me, and you don't necessarily have a coach who knows what they're doing, and so you just train in the middle, because instead of taking it too easy or being able to push on the good weeks, coaches could train much more than they do now, and on the bad weeks they should train less, but they don't have the capability to balance that really, or they're afraid to, or they don't know how, and so they just kind of train in the middle and hope for the best. And so we miss out in North American League of Legends on a lot of training time that we could be taking advantage of. And then on the other hand, there's sometimes we need to recover that we don't tune it down enough to have the fastest recovery from the edge of burnout so that we can get back on the horse. So I think that could be optimized a lot if coaches adopted heart rate variability tracking in the evenings or when people are sleeping, if they adopted some basic psychometrics, and if they knew what burnout was. From a psychological and physiological standpoint.
Yeah, not just the idea of it. I feel like another thing that players are encouraged to do is always play solo queue on their own, because it is a different game, and they learn new and different things doing that. After all the scrims, they're still expected to do solo queue training. We've seen some people stream because it's fun and it's exciting, and maybe you get some of that that you were talking about earlier. But then we also see other people that don't like to stream because they feel like it's distracting as well, and they don't actually get as good training. What do you think are the benefits of streaming versus kind of the cons, like maybe falling back into bad habits, whereas the benefits of just continuing the grind, maybe more burnout? Or do you think that some people maybe just would rather keep grinding and that's actually a more exciting thing?
So obviously the benefit of streaming is money, and teams want you to stream because the thing that we sell in esport, the thing that makes money for the professional level is views on faces, right? So the more streaming hours you have, the more advertising can be booked on you. And I don't know that there's any positive benefit to streaming for performance. I think that it increases the cognitive load of training, and so it just makes you more quickly approach burnout, because you have to try harder, you have to focus more, you have to worry more, you have an audience more. I think it's a good training tool if you're having anxiety and stage nerves to have to stream and train, because you have more stress. But you shouldn't do it if you are trying to minimize your stress, because it's higher anxiety and it's more difficult to pull off. And you have to kind of split your mind between thinking about your audience and thinking about your game, and so it reduces your training quality, I think. And there are many pros that don't stream for exactly that reason. They want to be the best. I think Luka's a good example. He said on an interview I saw a couple months ago where he said, I don't stream that much because I want to focus on being the best mechanically, and yet he's still doing some streaming. So that's nice of him, and I think that he's serving his audience and at the same time trying to figure out how to take care of his own optimization. As far as not streaming for, what was the second part of your question? It was if you're streaming, does it help you kick bad habits and increase the cognitive load, or it breeds bad habits? But then you said it might relax you more. Oh yeah. So there is a difference between the time that we spend playing in esport and the time that we spend training in esport, which I think is a good differentiation you're trying to make here. I think that we don't even know as coaches when a player is training and when a player is playing for fun. And if you think about it like a soccer player, right? They're training really hard, or they're just kicking the ball around and not thinking. You can really differentiate these things by their location. If they're on the training pitch with their team and there's coaches watching, they're probably training really hard. But if they're at home in their backyard and they're just kicking the ball against the wall, they might be taking it a little more relaxed. If they're playing with their 5 friends, in the afternoon, it depends on where their mind's at, right? So we don't really have a way to differentiate that in esport. And I've seen players who will play 5 games at night, and they'll be totally checked out, and they'll be recovering, and they'll have fun, and they'll int it, and they'll do whatever, and it's not intense, and they're fine. And then they'll recover from burnout, and they'll play 5 games a night also. But they'll try really hard, and they'll be putting more effort in. So I think it's all kind of up here where that switch is. I don't think it's necessarily time-based or training-based. I think it's your cognitive load, how much you're focused and how much you're striving. So that's something we differentiate with in scrims, actually. When I was doing triple blocks with TSM, we would have scrims when we knew that we were on the edge of burnout, where there would be no goal to learn very hard things. It would just be, fight as much as you can, and the skirmishing will train you, because your opponent is so good that if you make a mistake, they'll kill you. So fight them and have them teach you, and you don't need to think about it at all, And then when they're really focused and they can train hard, then we do high quality training, and we try not to make mistakes, and we try to teach ourselves the game. So I think that's something that you can modify as a player in your own head and in your approach to the game, and that you should modify, actually. You should flux it up and down and see how it works, have fun games and try hard games.
Thank you for that insight. So another thing, going back to kind of the beginning of the conversation, when we were talking about you coming in as kind of a boot camp situation, I feel like you oftentimes are put into environments, the team environments, when they're under a lot of stress, extra stress, more than just performing in the regular season. But in this case, TSM is trying to make it to the playoffs and then trying to perform in the playoffs so that they can get to Worlds. Because right now they have a pretty tough road ahead of them. I go back to MSI when Team Liquid seemed to really be struggling mentally with some of the pressure performing internationally and how that affects teams. What do you do, or what can players do to kind of fight back against panic and against these really high pressure situations where if they fail, and it is a kind of a permanent thing, or a long lasting failure? And how can you help train people to continue to think consciously and make calculated decisions and calm decisions, rather than, face smashing the keyboard and just hoping that it pays off?
Yeah, so there's kind of 2 questions in there. One is, how do you deal with the base level of stress and anxiety? So if you're playing ranked games, you're just more stressed. And after you lose the game or win the game, there's much higher emotional responses, and it can make you jittery and shaking and yeah. And then also, if you're running along in Fortnite and all of a sudden you realize you're getting shot, how do you stop the panic and just calmly think of which direction to build in? Or if you're in bot lane and you're just playing along all calmly and all of a sudden somebody flashes on you from the jungle, how do you not panic and how do you just stay focused and make right decisions, right? So the anxiety one is you do intentional practices to reduce your anxiety when you're not in a stress situation. So for example, before the game and in the morning and after the game when you've lost, those are all points when the stress that you have is completely unnecessary. You don't need it for your performance, and you don't need it for, it's just harming you. There's no other thing that it's doing than inciting your body to stress. So you should get good at coping. Find out how to reduce stress intentionally. You can do gratitude conditioning, you do mindfulness, you can do meditation, you can do walks and exercise, you can gauge your nutrition. There's all sorts of, you can cook, you can lose yourself in something flow state, whatever. And you can try to manage your anxiety that way. And then as far as in the game, the decision making, you just have to get really good at having the panic and making decisions too. So you step out of yourself and you observe, oh, I'm panicking. And what's really happening is your adrenaline is shooting through the roof. And that's actually helpful. It's speeding up your reflexes, it's speeding up your thought, it's speeding up everything. It's just that your trained response to that moment is crap. It's really bad. And you don't have a good trained response yet. Maybe in 1,000 iterations of that you will, hopefully, if you're good at learning. Otherwise, you'll always be gold 2, or gold 5 or whatever, because you don't learn. So what you want to do is you want to try to let the panic happen, because remember, it's not panic, it's just adrenaline spiking. Appreciate it and understand it, and then you want to focus on trying to make the best decision possible. And if you and do it slowly, okay, I'm going to respond to this gank. Okay, I'm going to find out where they're shooting from, think calmly, and then you'll die. And you'll be like, okay, I'm not thinking fast enough. But the next time, you'll go through the same thought process. Okay, I'm finding where I'm shooting from. Okay, I identified it. Okay, build the wall, or in League, okay, I'm going to, do I have my flash? Yes. Do I have this cooldown? Yes. Do they have their flash? And then you're thinking, what am I going to flash from this guy? I'm not going to panic flash. He's going to throw out an ability. What ability could, oh, I'm already dead. Okay, and then the next time you're like, what ability could it be? And you actually get there. So just progress forward till your speed increases, and don't worry about it if you die the first 7 times. Just go through the thought process that's logical. Also, review afterwards and visualize it. You can kind of get some fake training that way that accelerates you, so you don't need to go die 7 more times in a real game. You can die 3 times in your brain and maybe get some training effect from that.
Yeah, that's always a good point, reviewing, which I feel like a lot of people don't do. I should probably review more myself. So thank you for that. I have, you talked about being physical, which I would say is something that we see a lot from you. You're oftentimes posting about, working out and staying grounded in that. And we've seen that with other people that you've worked with, like Double Lift comes to mind, Sven Skaren. But then other people don't go to the gym very often. And I'm curious, there are professionals in League who work out and those who don't. So does it actually have a pretty big impact? What are your thoughts on that? And why should people be working out not only in the game and their keyboard skills, but their physical ability as well?
So if you're looking to optimize performance in sport, you start with, training. Okay, training is number 1, right? The more effective training, the more you learn. And then if you're looking at things outside of training to optimize, sleep is the number 1 thing. And then nutrition is the number 2 thing. And then exercise or physical activity is the number 3 thing in terms of cognitive effect. In terms of your brain and trying to optimize your learning and your performance and your preparation and your training. So it's up there, and it's way more powerful than a lot of other things that you can do. Including all these weird nootropic things and all this other miscellaneous stuff that kind of has very small effect sizes and aren't really proven. We know very thoroughly that that sleep and the nutrition and the physical activity have insane cognitive effects. So that being said, I believe that the main reason that we're seeing more and more fit people in esport is because it takes so much stamina to train 12 hours a day. So if you don't have a fit body and a fit approach to nutrition, then you're not going to be able to keep from burning out over and over again. And just natural selection will take over, and people who are just have more capabilities to train longer and harder hours with more focus will win out in the long term. So we see a gradual decline of people who look like gamers, and we see a gradual increase of people who look like athletes over the last 7 years in esport. Now it's important to differentiate between exercise and physical activity, because like you said, some of the players that I work with, seem to exercise and going to the gym, you cited. But that's not the thing that's really important for cognitive development and for health. The most important thing is physical activity, moving your body. So walking accomplishes that, juggling accomplishes that, biking. There's all sorts of things that are very incidental, that kind of fit in with just being active and conditioning the brain. And you need to get 30 minutes in 10-minute doses minimum, 30-minute dose per day with minimum 10 minutes per session of physical activity to keep up with the North American guidelines for physical activity. And then globally, I think it's more like 60 minutes a day for 5 days a week, with as low as 15 minutes being the minimum recommended amount. Those guidelines might have changed, but the general gist is if you're going to be going somewhere, park farther away and walk there. Or get off the train to stop early and walk there. Or find a way to get 15, 30-minute walks to and from locations and build more physical activity into your day. And if you can't do that, exercise a lot more. And you don't need to go to the gym to do that. You can do it by doing push-ups for 15 minutes in your room in between training, or as long as you're dosing yourself in 10, 15-minute increments and you're moving your body, you're coordinating your limbs, you're hitting that motor cortex in the brain, and you're making your heart pump and your blood flow, then you're doing the thing that's necessary to sustain your career. So don't get it twisted that you have to go to the gym and be like a bulking guy and need a ton of protein and lift stuff, and you don't need to learn a bunch of new exercises. Just move. There's actually, I was talking to a physical activity researcher in Finland who specializes in the cognitive effects of physical activity, and they're trying to figure out what the most optimal thing to do would be. I said, imagine this, you're a cognitive athlete, like an esport athlete, you train in scrimmages, what would you recommend is the most optimal thing to improve the learning from that scrimmage in terms of physical activity that you could do? And his response was either within the same day, possibly after scrimmage, after training, to do high-intensity interval training, which is, I'll explain that in a minute, but you can just look it up online, high-intensity interval training, HIIT, or within 4 hours at the end of the training to do something that involves complex coordination of some activity that you haven't learned yet. So juggling, or dancing, ballroom dancing, or something that requires you to coordinate your fingers, or your feet, or your legs, or your arms in some complex way that requires concentration. And that stimulates the motor cortex immensely. And the motor cortex is where all of your physical learning takes place for these esports. You're coordinating a visual stimuli with a movement. And so it's very sport-based, and stimulating the motor cortex in that way improves your learning. So you can see that you don't have to go to the gym and lift weights to do that. You can just make it about movement, about moving your body. By the way, that doesn't apply to Hearthstone players. Sorry, guys. You don't have any reflexes there. So just study, eat well, and do a lot of aerobics.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that is very interesting to hear the difference that could make, and that it's not even necessarily just about lifting weights. It's about the concerted effort to actually doing something. So thanks. Lastly, you talk about players needing to talk to each other and using their first name. What's the thought process behind that?
I guess when I started, I needed to create bonds of trust within the team. And so I needed them to see each other as humans, and I needed them to be vulnerable with each other. And so I just made it a policy to always call people by their names as a way to strip away the avatars that we build up in our online identity, because those are fine and they're great, but they aren't useful for me as a trainer. So I don't force people to do that. I might have in some of my first teams, but I just, from what I recall, I just did it. And then people just noticed and started copying me. And that's kind of how I institute that rule. So the idea behind it is to see your teammate as human, and to strip away the avatar so that people can be more vulnerable with each other. And the way that I do it is just by doing it. I think that because it happens so naturally, it's proof in a way that this is a more kind of comforting way to relate with your teammates when things are going badly, and to lean into them and to trust in them because you know who they are. I do many other activities that are much more powerful than calling people by their first names. Like if you switch to calling people by their first names, you're not going to just win. But it enables me to create a kind of environment based on vulnerability and trust that builds from that into many other different dates and activities and questionnaires with each other and stuff.
Thank you. And actually, a follow-up on that. When things get really difficult, and when people are in high-pressure situations, if they have kind of this trust, is that kind of the main key for them being able to work out like changes that need to happen to go forward? Or is it, should it be top down? Should it be player centric? What's a big key point in making sure that people can actually concentrate and do what they need to do to be successful?
Yeah, the ability to make a mistake and believe that your teammates want you to make that mistake because then afterwards you can learn from it. I think that's kind of necessary in sports teams, and you can really only do that if you know that your teammates like you, independent of whether or not you succeeded at the play. And so if you're going into a play and you're like, oh no, if I fail this, will my mid laner hate me or will my top laner hate me? You're not concentrating on the game. So you need to be thinking, okay, is this the right play? And where is their top laner, and should I engage now? And looking for that flash moment. And having no distractive thoughts about your social situation. And then after you fail the play, you need to be recovering and trying to figure out how to get to the next stage of the game and win it. You don't need to be thinking about now does my mid laner hate me or does my top laner hate me. So that's like 99% of what drives issues in terms of playing as a unit in a team. And so solving that solves 99% of the problems with playing with a unit as a unit with a team. Getting 100% buy-in on the play is so important.
And that does spark one more really quick. We've seen recently Impact said that he thinks of his teammates as kind of like business friends. How important is it to be a business friend or an acquaintance and have the trust rather than having the kind of, I know that they like me, so it's okay?
Yeah, I've run into many pros who say like, okay, I need to keep my teammates at arm's length because if I try to build too deep a relationship with them, it interferes with my ability to criticize them. It interferes with my ability to stay distant from their criticism and stay emotionally whole so I don't burn out. It's a very normal and healthy coping mechanism for very normal and healthy people. However, I don't believe that it is my preferred method of coaching. So this is some place where, there's obviously many different ways to, many different ways to cook a duck or something. There's just some saying like that, right? But anyway, I go towards brotherhood. I think that the reason that people have these coping mechanisms is because that's what average people do to deal with these situations. And I am always aiming for exceptionality, which, it may seem strange to say that Impact is not exceptional, but I think that, he has mastered his own approach, and that's fine. I'm working with people who want to become as exceptional with him, and they probably as exceptional as him, and they probably can't if they don't all in a little bit more on their life, right? And so I deal with trying to help people get more rugged, and actually they have criticism from their teammate and they love their teammate like a brother, and they develop more advanced and complex coping mechanisms with which to deal with that criticism. Or they love their teammate like a brother, and then they have to learn how to confront them. And so, sure, it's easy if you see them as a work friend, but it's kind of also a cop-out, right? It's much harder to love them like a brother and still confront them in that way. And so I see it as an opportunity to develop yourself to another level. But I always make sure to do it at the right time. Like, you need to be able to function as a team, and you need to build up the trust, and then you need to learn the coping skills and the conflict skills to confront people. But my philosophy and how I endeavor to coach teams is a little bit different.
Thank you for that. I always find that fascinating. I've heard a few different opinions on, should you be friends or should you just trust each other and kind of distance yourself. So thanks for explaining kind of your thought on that. And
the relationship you're aiming for, by the way, is like people who are at war with each other. So you don't really want to have like a friend relationship, and it's not like the closest thing it is to a family relationship, to a sibling, right? So it's like you might disagree with the person that this person that you're a brother in arms with. You might think that the person they have voted for president is an idiot. You might think that they are conservative or liberal too much for you. You might be annoyed with their sexual preferences. You might think that like they look dumb. They might annoy you with their laugh. But you develop a bond in this very rugged, intense environment of combat where you would actually literally jump in front of a bullet for them and take like your life for theirs. So that kind of intense relationship that is independent of the situation is really important in high performance environments like sport and war. If you think of war as an abstraction of that contest, if you think of sport as an abstraction of that contest of war, then you can kind of understand how that works. Now that's very different in business. Business is nothing like sport or war. It's not a closed loop system, so there can be many different winners. You don't really need to perform that well to succeed in business. You kind of just need to be tenacious. There's this kind of myth of like high performance business culture or whatever is just mostly a bunch of like average performers doing exceptional things with luck and tenaciousness and good systems and learning kind of like how to manipulate stuff and not sleeping very much, in my opinion. But that breaks down in sport, right? You have to like optimize yourself in terms of combat. And I think that that's a very different thing.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the further explanation. I really appreciate the interview, and best of luck with the little bit of time that you have left here. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. And check out Weldon. Take a close look at TSM and what they do. Thank you so much, and thank you. Catch you next time.